So Paul has just joined us. Thank you. So we're actually going to make a start now. So first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody this afternoon to this afternoon session on women in mental health, police stations, is it fit for purpose? So I'm Councillor Josie Channer. I'm a councillor in Barking and Dagenham. I've been a councillor for 10 years, but I'm also a former prison officer, and I also currently work for the Independent Office of Police Conduct, where I'm a senior investigator. So from my own personal experience, I'm very interested myself in how the next Labour government will be meet the challenge of providing support for women at the sharp end of experiencing poor mental health in custody. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. We've got Linda Bryant that we hope will be able to join us later on in the session. We've got Lord Keith Bradley, who's a peer who had authored a report in 2009 on women in mental health. We also have Paula Harriott from the Prisoner Policy Network, and we have Sarah Jones MP, Shadow Minister for Policing and the Fire Service. So welcome to our speakers. We're going to start with Lord Keith Bradley, who, as I mentioned at the start, authored a report on people with mental health problems or learning disabilities in the criminal justice system, and that was published in 2009. He's also a member of the advisory board on female offenders for the MOJ and a trustee of the Centre of Mental Health and Prisons and the Prison Reform Trust. So would like to welcome you, Lord Bradley, and would be very interested in if you could go into some of your findings in your report, and if there's any areas of recommendation that you feel still haven't been addressed, and any best practice that you picked up. So over to you. You're on mute, I'm afraid. If you would like to come off mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. I'll try again. Thank you for inviting me to make a brief contribution to today's excellent event. Briefly, I'll touch upon my report from 2009 and the work of the advisory board and the women's strategy. So first of all, very briefly, my report published in 2009, commissioned by the last Labour government, and I made 82 recommendations for change, but clearly in the time available, I won't go through all 82 of them. The principal building block of my report was why do so many people with mental health, learning disabilities and complex needs end up in the criminal justice system? And to try to change that situation, my key recommendation was the establishment of liaison and diversion teams, multidisciplinary teams, principally made up of mental health nurses and learning disability nurses, working alongside drug and alcohol services within and placed within police custody to support the police at that first point of contact with the criminal justice system with people with a range of vulnerabilities. It also linked to the development that we recommended of street triage, taking a step away further from the police custody to try and identify people in crisis and try and divert them from that point where they are in the community. What we've achieved over the 10 years since the report is now 100% coverage of the country of those services, but we recognise that it is the first key building block, and we need to enhance and develop liaison diversion services to make them more robust, more comprehensive, and meet greater needs. The information collected at that first point of contact with the criminal justice system, the early identification and assessment and screening work should influence the decision that the police make about whether to divert at that point or whether they need to continue down the criminal justice pathway to the courts, where the liaison diversion teams work in partnership with court officials, particularly the probation service, to use the information that's been collected at the first appearance in court to ensure that there isn't a delay in the next step, particularly stopping the overuse of remand into custody, awaiting for that information, working with probation on the pre-sentence report, and looking particularly not to use secure accommodation, but to use community sentences where appropriate, and not use short-term sentences and community sentences that are robust to deal with the vulnerabilities of the individual, particularly mental health treatment requirements, but not seen in a silo from alcohol services, drug services. So we deal with all the issues that the individual has presented with on that community sentence. Lots more work to be done on that. For liaison diversion to mean anything, we need much greater investment in the community services that support people in the community in crisis and support people in the community when they're on a community sentence. Quickly turning to the women's strategy. I've been on the government advisory boards for the women offenders since its inception. And I think what we've managed to achieve is ensuring that we look down the right end of the telescope for a women's strategy. When we started, it was very clear that the government really were looking at how we could support the more prisons for women, more women's places in prison, where we said, no, that's the wrong end of the telescope. What we should be doing is looking at how we stop women going into prison. And again, liaison diversion, I think, is a key building block to ensure that. As we talk, there are around about 4,000 women in prison, but about a third of those are on remand, waiting often to have court time to have a short-term sentence delivered. From my research, what we found is that women were on remand longer than the sentence they actually received. Therefore, no support, no help, but huge damage to the woman and her family by being in that situation. Often the children taken into care, they lose their housing, they lose their employment, they lose their benefits for no purpose, because when they go back to court, they're back into a worse situation than when they arrived. So we have to, again, look at community sentences where appropriate, using the menu of requirements that can be applied. But crucially, and this will be my final point in my 5 minutes, is what we need is a robust network of women's services across the country, enhancement of women's centres, making them robust financially and integral to the commissioning of women's services in all parts of the country, to ensure that whether they're in crisis and they need support, whether they're on a short-term sentence and need support, or if they've been in secure accommodation and come back into their local communities, they need support, that those services are available to them. We need that investment. They're very fragile at the moment, and the women's strategy is certainly ensuring that that is one of the key changes that we make going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Bradley. That was very interesting, and I guess an interesting opener to the debate that we're now going to have, because I think that there will be themes that's come out of what you've said around short-term sentences, around the need for more community sentences, and the great harm that happens to women when they do get sent into custody, and how drug and alcohol services work in silos. Unfortunately, these have been discussions that have been going on for 20 years. And I know that because it's the kind of things that I was saying 20 years ago when I was a prison officer at a women's prison. And unfortunately, it's still happening. And we need a Labour government that's going to be committed to exploring some of the issues to stop ending that cycle that's going on. But I'm now going to introduce Paula Harriott, who is from the Prisoner Policy Network, and we'll be very interested to hear from you, Paula, some of the experiences from the front line, and in particular, what do women with mental health crisis need, and what policies would help from the courts and in the prisons and policing. So over to you, Paula.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, well, I don't disagree with anything that Keith has said at all. You know, we definitely, the progress around liaison and diversion is to be welcomed. And I personally have been involved in the development of the peer support component within liaison and diversion. So diverting women out of the criminal justice system is an imperative. And I think that's what we can do more in liaison diversion is we're doing well on the liaison, but we're not doing so well on the diversion. And we need to strengthen the understanding in the courts and in the police custody suites of the necessity to divert people and the CPS to not press charges for people who would only receive a very low level criminal justice intervention, and to divert them into women's centres, to divert them into community services at police custody stage, even before going to court. And I think we could do a lot more with the CPS about understanding the necessity to do that, to stop overloading prisons and to recognise deeply that prisons are places where harm is done to women. Prisons are not places of restitution. They're not places of healing. They're not places, there are places sometimes for women to get respite, but surely we can offer that respite in the community. And prison should not be used as a place of safety for women. And the next Labour government needs to make sure that that doesn't happen, because it still happens to this day, that magistrates and courts are at a loss what to do with women who are in mental health crisis and do still use prisons as a last resort. And I think that's to our shame. I think that's to our shame as a community. And I think that we need to be, Keith talked about looking at the lens through which we're looking at this problem. It definitely isn't about creating more places for women in prison. It is definitely about strengthening community services, but broadening out that lens, looking as also about the causes of mental ill health amongst women, and what we can do in terms of economic and social and political interventions that address those sort of the causes of mental ill health and poor mental well-being in this country. You know, looking at the impact of patriarchy on women, our place in society. What are we doing more to rebalance the equity of the life that we can lead as women in this country and not be subject to patriarchal values and patriarchal expectations and lack of opportunities just because we're women? How do these things affect our mental well-being? Because they definitely affect mine. So these are something that we're sensitive to, and I don't think women should not speak up about this. The causes of mental ill health for women in prison are the same causes of mental ill health that affect women in general. Women in prison aren't people who are us. I am a former prisoner. I'm a former prisoner. I'm a woman just like anybody else. So we should start to address the notion of women who are in the criminal justice system because we have commonality with all women in terms of living in society where there is unequal treatment for women, unequal access to mental health service provision for all members of the community. Yes, we're living at the margins. We're experiencing the worst impact people in the criminal justice system of many of the economic, social and political inequalities that we see in community. But we should not be othering and having discussions about women in the criminal justice system as if they're not part of the sisterhood of women in general. And I would like the party going forward to stop this language that tries to treat cohorts as if they're different and doesn't understand that they are there because they are experiencing the worst of everything that we are all experiencing in communities where there is poverty, where there is poor access to mental health service provision. So for me, we're on the right path in terms of identifying the issue, but we can broaden out the lens and broaden out the language. And I think that for me, the final thing to say on this is that the deficit of people who have experienced these issues is to the detriment of the potential impact we can have in redefining our policy and our positions. It's not enough to make decisions about others without including them. We're socialists. We believe in inclusion, and that means that the lived experience voice of people who are living within the criminal justice system with mental health issues needs to be absolutely made space for on panels, needs to be made sure that these people are invited into the discussions and actually move to positions of not being the beneficiaries of service and the beneficiaries of our compassion, but actually turn into the leaders that we want, who will lead the dialogue and change the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulie. That is very brought to the fore of our discussion around issues around, making sure that there's a wider debate that we have about inequality and, the inequalities that all women face around access to health provision, economic inequality, and how women are spoken about in general, and how that affects women that at the very sharp end experiencing so much difficulty. So thank you for that. So moving on, before I forget, I would like to remind everybody that you can ask questions. Please put them in to the questions chat bar. It's got icon with a little question mark on there. If you've got any questions that you would like to put to our panelists, put them in that section, questions and answer section, as we go through, and then at the end of the panel discussion we will seek to answer those questions. Also, please tweet this event if you can, and promote the issues and subjects that we're discussing. So I would now like to introduce Linda Barrett. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So that's Linda Bryant, sorry. She's Chief Executive of Together for Mental Wellbeing, and Together for Mental Wellbeing offers a wide variety of support for people with experiencing mental health distress, and for over 20 years Together has developed services for services within the criminal justice setting. And in Linda's role as Director of Criminal Justice Service, she led the expansion of the charity's criminal justice portfolio, and which included development of the gender specific response for women in the justice system. So we're very pleased to have you this afternoon, Linda. And again, we would like to focus on the experiences on the front line of working with women with experiencing mental health crisis in the criminal justice system. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Linda, if you would like to just take yourself off mute. I think Linda might have frozen, or is it just me? Can anybody else hear Linda? No. You can't hear me, sorry. Can you hear me now? So I'm afraid, Linda, you've frozen. Linda might has logged out, and she might rejoin us, hopefully. So we're now going to ask Sarah Jones to comment on some of the things that she's heard this afternoon. So Sarah Jones is Shadow Minister for Policing and the Fire Service, and she's also the MP for Croydon Central, elected in 2017, and winning that marginal seat in 2017 and increasing her majority in 2019. So well done, Linda, Sarah. I know I've just introduced Sarah a little bit, but Linda's now back with us. So
I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on
now.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, that's fine. So if you don't mind, Sarah, we're going to go back to Linda because I think
I don't know if you could hear anything I was saying. I think I was talking to myself for a while.
Really? Okay.
Okay, I'll be quick just in case.
No problem.
So thanks, Josie. I'm so sorry. It's been a bit of a nightmare. It was just to talk very briefly about our experience of kind of 20 years of working in criminal justice services, and specifically about women. And I feel I'm going to be a bit doomy and gloomy because so much has happened since Keith's report. And Keith, I'm sorry I didn't hear what you were that you said just now, but I mean, I think from our perspective, we're still experiencing that women are completely disadvantaged as soon as they touch the sides of the justice system, really. So we know that the knowledge and understanding of criminal justice professionals and health professionals in relation to women's specific needs are still not what they should be. They've got massively better. People do have a better understanding, but women are still facing discrimination and their needs not being met. We're finding that women are still being at risk of being charged and remanded for offences that they've committed in retaliation to being on the end of domestic abuse, for example. So when the police are called by the partner, it's the woman that gets arrested. Their physical health needs are still being ignored. So when I spoke to practitioners in our courts in preparation for this, they're still talking about pregnant women who are being held in custody who haven't had a health check when they entered custody, and they should be. We have a women's practitioner at Westminster Magistrates Court, where there are a high volume of people who are foreign nationals who go through that court, and foreign national women have a really hard time of it. There's a lot of bias and discrimination. There is women are not believed. There's a real lack of effort to communicate with them. There's a lack of effort to ensure that they understand their rights and the processes they're being subjected to. There are lots of missed opportunities for those women to have proper assessments. There's a lack of appropriately trained interpreters. And that worries us hugely, because the very worst outcome is that we're missing women at risk of self-harm and suicide who are remanded back into custody. Agenda published last week from a literary review from the Young Women's Justice Project about the experiences of young women in the criminal justice system. And shamefully, there's a lot we don't know about them, but from that literary review, up to 90% of young women who are coming into criminal justice system have been abused by a family member or someone they trust. The use of force, restraint and isolation against young women in custody settings is on the increase. and that's being used to manage their behaviours and even their self-harm. So there's a lot of challenges still for women of all groups. And Paula, I absolutely take your point about the sisterhood of women, and it's absolutely important we put it under that. But there are also these groups within that who are getting a really hard time of it. But the solutions, to try and be a bit more positive, is, you know, and Baroness Corston talked about this, and we've all talked about it. Women shouldn't be in prison. We shouldn't have prisons for women where women are at risk of harming others, whatever that might look like. We need to get to the bottom of the causes of why they present those risks, and we need to be helping them and supporting them in the least restrictive settings. That doesn't mean to say that they don't go through the judicial process, but we need to give them a fair crack at their life chances. I think we need to strengthen policies of prevention, which are absolutely critical. Women don't experience mental distress in isolation to the rest of their life experiences, and I think there's a real role for local authorities, who are the main funder of social care in the community, to be stepping up and ensuring that they're demonstrating empathy to women, but radical empathy, that they educate themselves about the needs of women, they understand the experiences from the perspective of women, and they do something about it. It's not just about the Equality Act. They need to be pro-women in all its manifestations, and we're talking about very vulnerable women. We heard yesterday, and Paula, you spoke brilliantly about the network of women's centres. That needs to be national, it needs to be policy, and it needs to be funded. You know, it's 14 years after Baroness Corston. They work, they're local, and they do what they say on the tin, and they get really brilliant outcomes. And it's beyond me why we're not properly funding those women's centres. That is, I think, for me, the answer to a lot of what we're talking about today. And we have a policy of early intervention at arrest. So we do have diversionary models, but again, there's not enough of it. And the criteria for women being diverted at that point, so pre-arrest and arrest stage, is just too narrow. So again, women who've experienced domestic violence, again, they're not accessing that early diversionary, because, you know, if the police entered the flat and she's holding a knife because she's trying to defend herself, a knife crime will not provide the opportunity for her to be diverted at an early stage. And we've talked about the NHS led liaison and diversion services. Brilliant program. It's been doing brilliantly, but we need more specialist women in those services who are trained in trauma-informed practices. Again, you know, I just think there isn't enough specialism to really focus on the specific needs of women. And I'm going to stop there so that I cut my losses, but I hope that you could still hear me.
Thank you, Linda. That was really interesting. Some of the very real challenges that the next Labour government will have to face. I don't think any of us here, unfortunately, think that the current government will work towards challenging those disparities that are still there. But we do hope that this discussion will, and other future discussions over the next coming years, will feed into Labour policy, into how do we overcome this cycle, really. So on that, I would like to introduce Sarah Jones, the MP for Croydon and Shadow Minister for Policing and Fire Service, who MP for Croydon Central. And as I begun to introduce her before, I think I might have mentioned that she was set up the all party parliamentary group on knife crime, and that was launched in 2017, and she was then elected as the group's chair. And that group aims to look in detail at the root causes of knife crime and with a particular focus on prevention. So I'd like to invite Sarah to comment on what she's heard so far, and also any ideas or things that she's thinking that Labour might be able to put in place. Thank you, Sarah. I think you're on mute, Sarah. So if you click on the microphone, it should have a green dot by it to make sure and that's to say that you're on. Slightly different from Zoom. I can hear you now. Great.
Can you hear me now? Oh, it said it was on, and also now my battery is telling me it's low, but it should be fine for the duration, and I'll plug it in when I stop. Firstly, just thank you ever so much for inviting me, and it's a really professional panel of experts, and it's the wealth of knowledge in terms of the speakers, and also the people I can see are listening is great. So I don't want to talk too much. I want to listen more to what you say. Linda just mentioned that the literature review that came out that I was reading this morning, actually, and it is incredible. I'd recommend it to people who want to get a kind of overview of the situation that women are facing. It's really useful piece of work. So just to say a bit about the Labour Party and sort of where we're coming from in terms of policy development first. I mean, I guess our job is twofold at the moment. The first is to hold the government to account, but by doing that, to try and get policies implemented now that improve the outcomes for women. It's no good waiting until we get into government. We've got to be trying to change the agenda now. And the second job I have is to try and develop those policies over the long term that hopefully when we are elected in 2024, we can put into practice. So I think we have an active role to play in this debate and in the kind of development of policy now, as well as looking ahead at 2024. All of our policy will be grounded in our values and our kind of core values that we all know and understand. But I think to Paula's point, which is so important about kind of inclusion and solidarity, I think there are two policy areas that Keir has talked about that I just wanted to touch on, because I think they're really important in this debate. The first is that what he said to Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's the Shadow Home Secretary, and I, when we got our position, and what he said publicly is that one of our top priorities is to keep people safe, to make sure the population understand that they can trust Labour to keep them safe. Well, when we say that, obviously most of the debate, the public discourse is around the number of policing, the kind of national security effort. But when we say we want to keep people safe, we are also talking about women who are being held in a custody suite because they've stolen a mobile phone and they've got violence at home that they're scared of returning to, and they've got a mental health problem that is unresolved. Those women are not safe. And when we say that we're here to keep everyone safe, we mean everyone, and that is inclusive, and it includes the woman who is on remand in prison, who can't look after her children or even speak to her children, and is self-harming. That woman is not safe. And I think it's really important that policy is understood in that inclusive sense. And the second one is that Keir has talked this week about the family and how Labour is the party of the family. And of course we are. You just have to look at all the policies that we've introduced. And there's been some debate about what does family mean? Well, family it means everyone in all shapes and sizes, and as Wes Streeting wrote in the pink paper, and there's been comment on this, but family means that woman on remand in prison who can't talk to her children, who wants to have the agency to be able to build a life for her family when she gets out of prison, but can't because nobody is helping her, and nobody is providing the services that she needs. So when we talk about being the party of the family, we mean being the party of the woman who's on remand who can't help her kids, just as much as we mean everybody else. And I think that's a really important starting point and principle to say. Turning to the issue that we're here to talk about in particular, it's a real struggle for me to know which issues to pick to talk about, because every single issue under the sun comes under what we're talking about. There are so many problems here that we need to tackle, although it's completely possible to have the right policies to do the right things. Of course, this brief goes across, I cover policing, David Lammy and his team cover the kind of justice end. You've got Rosanna, who's covering the mental health end, and I know that we all need to join up. But the question, are women safe in these environments? If they're suffering from mental health issues and they're in custody or they're in prison, are they safe? Are we providing the right? Of course not. I mean, I think we all looked last week at the execution of Lisa Montgomery in America, and we all thought, this poor woman who had an entire life of abuse and mental health problems and neglect, and was probably psychotic at the time she committed the crime that she committed, but she was executed anyway. We all thought, well, goodness, at least we're not as bad as America. But you read reports of women who have lost children in labour because they haven't been given the support that they need, because they've been in prison, they haven't got to hospital in time, they haven't been given access to services in prison. And you wonder, we have a huge problem that we need to try and solve, and we certainly shouldn't be sitting back on our laurels, though some progress has been made over the years. I think for me, there are kind of layers upon layers of inequality and problems that we need to be looking at. One is around data and research, and making sure we have people who've been in prison, people who have mental health problems, people who are service users of services at the heart of that, so that we actually understand what the problem is. That's the starting point that we know we don't know enough about. We know that as a society we don't pay enough attention on these issues because relatively small numbers of women are involved, and they're at the very margins, as Paula said, the kind of very margins of where we all of all the experiences of the rest of us. And so we need to try and shine a light on some of these issues more effectively. We know that services aren't designed with women in mind, particularly in criminal justice, because the vast majority of people in the system are men. So nobody, I was about to say nobody thinks about it. Of course they do. You all think about it. Lots of people think about it, but there isn't enough of a real design around the needs of women in those services. And we know there's a postcode of some fantastic examples of brilliant practice, but it's very much, where you end up and whether you're in a place that has those kind of services, and whether you're lucky enough to be able to access those things. We know there are issues we talked about already, the kind of issues of women going on remand. We know women more likely to go into prison, with the first offence. We know that custody suites in prisons, in police, the police custody suites don't sort of aren't designed or built to support women. We know all of the problems that we face in the criminal justice system generally around lack of funding. And around lack of alternatives, diversion, service provision for trying to help people have the agency to improve their own lives. And then on top of all of that, you have the inequalities of society as a whole, and the discrimination that comes as a result of that. So I know there's a huge arena of policy here that we need to be looking at, and I know that you will all be looking at the particular aspects of perhaps the mental health white paper last week, and for me, my area of policy involvement there is that you shouldn't be having people with mental health crises being in police cells, that isn't a safe place, and that's a good thing that the government is saying that should be stopped. There's all kinds of things we can look at from COVID and what's happened there, the early release scheme and why that kind of didn't work, but also was talking to Nina about the access to iPads and the IT, so that you can actually talk to your family members in when you're in prison, and how amazing it would be if that service could be provided to people more widely, so they could learn and they could be educated and they could make connections to their family and they could get advice and support. And I know there's a whole raft of policies in this area that we need to be looking at. I know I need to stop because I will say far too much, but I would just end by saying we know that girls and women are in a minority in the criminal justice system. The service is not designed for them, but we do know there are areas where services have been designed with them in mind, where women can be given the support that they need and the agency that they need to get themselves into a place where they can have healthy and supported lives. In London, we know that the Deputy Mayor for Policing, Sophie Linden, has... Oh, gosh.
Okay, I think we've lost Sarah there, unceremoniously, but we're going to move on to some questions now. I think her contribution was very interested in wrapping us up actually, and just pulling together some of the things that have been said during this discussion. But for the last 15 minutes, we do have some questions come through, and if there's any more, please do put them in the question and answer section. So we have a question from Sanchia. She's asked what can local authorities do, or what services could they lend their support to in terms of preventative measures? So we'll start with Lord Bradley. You're on mute, I'm afraid. We can hear you now, Lord Bradley, I think. Oh, no, we can't. We can't hear you. We still can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. The green light refused to come on. Yeah, local authorities play an absolutely crucial role, and the decimation of funding for local authorities across the board has had a serious impact on preventative and early intervention work. And that's particularly true of the interface with public health and the wider health agenda, which needs to be re-established. But also, I think we have to have a far better commissioning arrangement at a local level, so that all the agencies, whether it be criminal justice, NHS England, local authorities, and the voluntary sector, crucially, are all part of that commissioning framework, so that they can all actually contribute to that community and preventative agenda. And I'll just pick up on one of the recommendations I made, and that the latest mental health white paper recommended, is that commissioning of healthcare in police custody should be transferred to the NHS, because that stops the great inequality of provision with different police forces determining their own priorities. So we should have a national framework in which this operates. And I hope we'll seize the opportunity yet again to press in the consultation for that change, so that we have a national framework. That doesn't mean to say it has to be all the same everywhere, but it sets a minimum, at least, standard of provision to benefit women within the criminal justice system.
Thank you. So Sarah, you're back with us. We're just going through some questions here. So we've got a question about what can local authorities do, or what policies can they lend their support to in terms of preventative measures. So I'll come to you last. Paula, have you got any ideas on that?
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, just supporting what Keith said again, but reiterating the fact that we need to increase and widen the access for women to low-level mental health support and mental well-being. So in a sort of a preventative way. And I've seen some good examples recently of free to access counselling for women in my hometown in Birmingham. And I think that this has been an enormous help under COVID. So I think we should be really thinking about how women have been impacted under COVID around heightened anxieties and sort of strengthening local authorities' resolve to broaden access to mental health support for women. And just going back to a point that Sarah made, which is not responding to local authorities, but I don't want to lose the opportunity to say this. I'd like to see the party speaking out more about early release for imprisoned mothers in prison at the moment under COVID. And to remind the audience that in March this year, it'll be 1 year of solitary confinement for prisoners, and that includes women. And I'd like to be speaking up more about early release for women in prison under COVID and the return of some form of access for children to their parents, and particularly their mothers in prison. So it'll be a year in March this year that children will have had no access to their parents.
Thank you for the live. Linda, do you want to comment on that question about local authorities?
Can you hear me? Check. Well, yeah, I mean, just to add to what Keith and Paula said, I mean, I think local authorities, there's been an erosion of their powers over recent years, and the erosion of their kind of ability to coordinate good quality community support services. I mean, these, we are citizens, and local authorities have a responsibility, particularly around social care needs. And it worries me greatly that it's local authority budgets that are going to be absolutely being hammered by the current pandemic. And that worries me greatly that that's going to take a number of years to build up again. And it will be women and other marginalized groups that are going to be on the sharp end of that. And I do think, as Keith mentioned, and I would say this because I'm from the voluntary sector, that it's the small grassroots voluntary sector organizations who will know where the women are, who they are, what their needs are, and how they can be supported. And it's really for local authorities to be trying to coordinate with health commissioners to be funding those small grassroots organizations, many of which are not going to survive this pandemic. But it will be those organizations who are close to communities and close to women in those communities. And they're the kind of organizations that will be able to, I think, make the most difference. And I'm also really concerned about local authorities' abilities to meet the needs of women who've got substance misuse and alcohol misuse problems. We know the vast numbers of women who struggle with that and all the complicated health issues that come with it. So I think local authorities have an absolute crucial role, and I really hope that because this is not all about clinical care. Vast majority of people who suffer mental distress do not need secondary care mental health services. They need primary care, and they need social care in the community.
Thank you, Linda. Sarah, would you like to add anything onto that? You're mute. You're mute, I'm afraid.
Sorry. There we go. Is that better? Yeah. It's weird. It seems to mute itself without me pressing it. Just a couple of things. Just absolutely hear what your point, Paula. It's something I'll take away. It's the justice team that are leading on those issues in terms of early release under COVID. But yeah, I mean, 23.5 hours a day in a prison cell for a year is extraordinary, isn't it? And you can only imagine the damage that's doing, and that we see it played out through the kind of self-harm and other issues that have come to the fore as well. On local authorities, yeah, I mean, local authorities, my local authority has 60% less grant now than it did in 2010 from the government. I mean, you can't chop off a couple of legs and expect somebody to, you know, a person to be able to function. It's like the quantity of money that has gone from local authorities is so extreme that they just, you know, are in the point where they just have to do their statutory responsibilities, and even then they're kind of stretched, and that needs to be fixed, because of course they have an absolutely core role, as do, you know, the voluntary sector, the health and other agencies as well, of course. And this is the same debate that I've been having for the last 3 years in terms of youth violence and the need for local authorities and health and all the organisations to have the funding that they need to be able to do the prevention services that we need to see. I mean, I was in a school, well, before COVID it was now, actually, a fantastic school that manages to keep a lot of children who have very complex needs in the school and not exclude them, which compares, you know, very differently to a lot of other schools in Croydon that exclude a lot of kids. And he introduced me to a young girl who should really have been excluded. She'd been found with a group when knife violence had occurred. She'd done lots of things that were beyond what you would normally exclude a child for, but she had a history of sexual abuse, and she had mental health problems. They were waiting on referrals from CAMHS and so she wasn't getting any support, and he was tearing his hair out saying, well, what on earth am I supposed to do? She can't get any help. If I exclude her now, she'll just be into the community and she'll become even more vulnerable. And, you know, local authorities have convening roles, they have direct service provision roles, and they are the local leaders that need to bring organisations together to find solutions, and they just can't, because they have been so underfunded for so long.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a bit of feedback, I don't know why. I don't know if you can hear that. So we have a really great question. What does, hang on, let me see if I can get it up. What does a trauma-informed model look like? I'll repeat that question. What does a radically different trauma informed model look like? I'm going to open that. We've only got 6 minutes left, so anyone can answer that. But there was also a question that said, is police custody an appropriate place for a woman to be taken? I can answer that. It's not, and there actually has been new guidance for the police that's come into force last year about what is a safe place for somebody experiencing mental health crisis, and making it more difficult for police to take them to a police station as a place of safety. A place of safety is a healthcare facility. So what does a radically different trauma-informed model look like? To quickly have any thoughts on that one? Linda?
Well, a radically different trauma-informed model would be no women in prisons, and women are not locked up, and we divert them unless it's a violent offence, and then we get to the root causes of why a woman has committed a violent offence. So a radically different model is we just don't lock women up, because it is traumatising in every possible way for women.
Anybody else on thoughts of that on that one? I think
just to say that I totally endorse that. I think that trauma-informed services start from the premise that we have to negate the trauma, that people are enduring. And I think that a socialist answer is to think more broadly about how we prevent that in the first place from occurring. So I think it's about the recognition of where harm occurs to people and what we do about that. Yeah, but in the short term, working within women's centres where there is a trauma-informed model, which is about human kindness and empathy, and about a recognition that when we re-trigger trauma through our questioning in our seek to support, that this is harmful, additional harm. So this is why I exhort people to please desist from trauma tourism. When you have people with lived experience panels, please don't ask them to revisit the trauma in order to inform you. It's not the responsibility of damaged individuals to educate a system that damages it. So I think it's about sensitivity, trauma. I think it's about socialism. It's about inclusivity. It's about the values that sit at the heart of why we're part of this movement. And I think just to remember that in all of our work is an important a lesson for us all.
Thank you, Paula. That's a great response. We've got a last question. I'm afraid we haven't got time to get to some of the others, but just the last question in the last 2 minutes. Is enough attention being paid to the intersectionality of race and gender? What changes are needed to ensure that the needs of Black and Asian and minority ethnic groups? Does anybody have any thoughts on that one?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Not me.
I was crackling up.
I heard it. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the question was about whether enough intersectionality, whether enough attention has been paid to the intersection of race and gender, and what changes are needed to ensure the needs of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, and then I can't read the rest of it because it goes on to a different bit. But I think that the point is enough attention hasn't been paid, and I think we're kind of learning all the time at the kind of different layers of discrimination that sort of layer on top of each other that we need to understand. And just going back to the other point about whether custody is an appropriate place for women, I just wanted to make sure I'd made the point before we finish about custody in terms of in policing. The police talk to me all the time about this not being appropriate for women and this not, police who are having to, deal with people who are having acute mental health crises, who are suffering acute trauma at home, and going through very difficult lives. The police don't want to be the people that are, they recognise they are not qualified, they should not be dealing with women in these spaces, and that's not the right approach. And I think I just wanted to make sure I'd made that point before we finish, because it's important, because they are often, there's a big debate in policing at the moment about how do you set targets for what police do and for criminal outcomes, and what they say is, well, how do you set a target for when we stay with somebody because we think that they are going to harm themselves, and we need to make sure we wait until someone comes, or you can't measure that in terms of outcomes, and they are deeply frustrated at the position that they find themselves in. So I think that you have allies in policing as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid.
Can I just quickly add? I mean,
go ahead.
Can I just quickly add? I absolutely support what Sarah's saying, but you've got to have the alternative provision and the investment in those alternatives to police custody. I was horrified when I did my report. I live in Manchester, that's where I'm speaking from. They had no 136 place of safety in the city of Manchester. After 10 years, we have a one-bedded unit. That is just not good enough. And we have to have the alternatives to support the police in their ambition not to be the default position as police custody as a place of safety.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very good point to end on, and we've had a really good discussion this afternoon. I would really want to thank all the panelists for attending. It's been a really interesting debate, and some of the issues that I think we've been saying for a very long time, we've actually said again and reinforced them and the need for them. So thank you everybody for coming this afternoon. I'm going to close the session. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Linda.
I'm just going to can I take a photo? Am I able to take a photo? Just
Bye.
I just want to
Lovely to see you.
Bye, Sarah.
if you
Nice
don't
to meet
mind.
you.
that we can publicise the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Josie.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.